The blood trickling from Grace Seymour's split lip tasted like iron and defeat as she stared at her reflection in the cracked mirror. Wyoming Territory, 1878, had promised her a new beginning, but her husband's fists had broken that promise just like they'd broken her spirit. Grace dabbed at her swollen cheek, wincing as the cool cloth touched the purpling bruise forming beneath her right eye. Harold Seymour, once the charming businessman who'd swept her off her feet in Chicago 3 years ago, had shown his true nature shortly after they'd moved to Opal. The town's booming oil business had drawn them west, but the isolation had only served to unmask the monster behind her husband's polished facade. "You'll stay in this room until I return," Harold had snarled before slamming the bedroom door. The lock clicked from the outside, a modification he'd added after her first attempt to flee 6 months ago. "And if you even think about trying to leave again, I'll make sure you never walk properly again." Grace leaned against the washbasin, her body trembling. At 26, she had become a prisoner in her own home. The elegant house on the edge of town that had once seemed like a palace now felt like a tomb. Harold's reputation as a successful businessman and generous town benefactor ensured that her few cries for help went unheard or, worse, disbelieved. As the afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains, Grace made a decision. She couldn't survive another beating. This time, Harold's rage had been sparked by a simple spilled glass of whiskey. Next time, and there would be a next time he might not stop, Grace moved to the window and looked out at the vast Wyoming landscape. The distant mountains stood strong against the horizon, and the wild prairie stretched endlessly. Somewhere out there was freedom. She just had to find it. With shaking hands, Grace pried up the loose floorboard beneath her bed where she'd been secretly stashing away coins and small bills from the household money. It wasn't much, but it might be enough to get her far away from Opal. She wouldn't have another chance. Harold would be at his weekly poker game until late, giving her precious hours of opportunity. The climb down from the second-story window was treacherous, especially with her ribs aching from Harold's kicks, but determination gave Grace strength she didn't know she possessed. The trellis creaked under her weight as she descended, praying it wouldn't collapse and alert the housekeeper who remained downstairs. When her feet finally touched the ground, Grace didn't allow herself to look back at the house. She slipped through the garden and into the growing dusk, clutching her small satchel containing her meager savings and a few essential items. The evening air carried the scent of sage and dust as she hurried along the back paths, avoiding Main Street, where someone might recognize her. The livery stable at the edge of town was her destination. If she could secure a horse, she might make it to the next town before Harold discovered her missing. The stableman, old Mr. Peterson, was known to be kind, and she hoped he might help her without asking too many questions. But as Grace approached the stable, she froze. Harold's business associate, Frank Dunning, was just exiting the building, laughing with another man. Her heart hammered against her bruised ribs as she ducked behind a water trough, waiting for them to pass. Frank would surely report seeing her to Harold. "Miss, you all right there?" A quiet voice asked from behind her. Grace spun around, nearly losing her balance in her panic. Standing a few feet away was a tall man with a weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of a dusty hat. His clothes were those of a working cowboy, worn leather chaps, faded blue shirt, and scuffed boots. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, clear blue, and filled with a gentle concern that seemed utterly foreign after years of Harold's cold stare. I'm fine," Grace managed, tugging her shawl closer to hide the bruises on her neck. "Just waiting for someone." The cowboy's gaze flickered briefly to the visible bruise on her face, then back to her eyes. He didn't comment on it, but something in his expression shifted. "Name's Jackson Quinn. Most folks just call me Jack." He tipped his hat slightly. "Couldn't help but notice you seemed in a hurry to be somewhere." "I need to leave town," Grace whispered before she could stop herself. "Tonight." Jack Quinn studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable in the deepening twilight. Then he nodded once. "I reckon that might be arrangeable," he said, his voice low and calm. "I'm heading out to the Clearwater Ranch tonight myself. It's about 20 miles east. Owner's a decent woman who might have use for an extra pair of hands if you're looking for work." Grace hesitated, weighing her options. Trust didn't come easily anymore, but something about the cowboy's steady gaze and the respectful distance he kept gave her a flicker of hope. "Frank's gone now," Jack said, nodding toward the now empty street. "I can help you get a horse if that's what you're needing." "Why would you help me?" Grace asked, the wariness of years coloring her voice. Jack's expression remained calm as he replied, "Madam, in these parts, we don't ask many questions when someone's in trouble, but we don't turn our backs either." A shout from the direction of her home made the decision for her. Even at this distance, she recognized Harold's voice bellowing her name in rage. He had returned early. "I'd be grateful for that horse," Grace said, her voice stronger than she felt. Jack nodded once and moved toward the stable with purpose, not rushing but not wasting time either. Inside, he spoke briefly with the stableman, who cast a sympathetic glance toward Grace's partially concealed face before disappearing into the back stalls. "Peterson's saddling a mare for you," Jack explained. "Gentle but strong. She'll carry you far if needed." Grace clutched her small bag of possessions tighter. "I can pay," she began, reaching for her meager savings. Jack shook his head. "Keep your money. You're likely to need it more down the road." The stableman returned leading a dappled gray mare already saddled. "This here's Willow," he said, handing the reins to Grace. "She's sure-footed, even at night." Before Grace could respond, the sound of approaching horses rattled the quiet evening. "That'd be your husband, I'm guessing," Jack said, his voice still calm despite the urgency of the situation. "Harold Seymour's known for his temper around these parts, though not many speak of it openly." Grace's head snapped up in surprise. "You know who I am, Mrs. Seymour. Half the town suspects what goes on behind your closed doors, but your husband's influence runs deep." Jack's jaw tightened slightly before he continued. "There's a back way out. Follow me." Without waiting for a response, Jack led his own horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding, toward a rear door of the stable. Grace followed, leading Willow, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain it would give them away. The shouting grew closer. Harold was gathering men for a search. "They'll check the stage depot first, then the train station," Jack said as they emerged into a narrow alley behind the stable. "We need to head east immediately, off the main trails." Grace hesitated only a moment before mounting Willow, gritting her teeth against the pain in her ribs. Jack swung effortlessly onto his gelding. "Stay close," he instructed, "and if trouble comes, let me do the talking." They rode out of town under the cover of gathering darkness, taking a little used path that skirted the eastern edge of Opal. The night air was cool against Grace's swollen face, bringing a small measure of relief to her physical pain, if not her emotional turmoil. They traveled in silence for nearly an hour, pushing the horses at a steady pace. Grace found herself watching Jack straight back as he rode ahead of her. There was a quiet competence in his movements that spoke of a lifetime in the saddle. When they finally slowed to rest the horses near a small creek, Grace allowed herself to truly breathe for the first time since leaving the house. The stars spread across the Wyoming sky in a brilliant canopy, reminding her of just how vast the world was beyond her prison. "We should be safe to stop for a short while," Jack said, dismounting and leading his horse to water. "Your husband's men won't expect you to have gone this direction." Grace slid carefully from the saddle, her body protesting every movement. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the full extent of her injuries made themselves known. She swayed slightly, catching herself against Willow's flank. Jack was beside her in an instant, his hand hovering near her elbow but not touching her. "You're hurt worse than you're letting on," he observed, his voice gentle but matter-of-fact. "I'll be fine," Grace said automatically, the response trained into her over years of hiding Harold's abuse. Jack's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "There's a small cabin about an hour's ride from here. Belongs to a friend who won't be using it this season. We can stop there for the night, let you rest properly before continuing on to Clearwater tomorrow." Grace wanted to refuse, to insist they continue, but the throbbing pain in her side and the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her made the decision for her. "Thank you," she said simply. They rode on, the moon rising to light their way through the rolling landscape. Grace found herself studying her unexpected rescuer in the silver light. Jack Quinn wasn't particularly handsome in the conventional sense, but his face had character laugh lines at the corners of his eyes, a straight nose that might have been broken once, and a firm jawline covered in several days' worth of stubble. The cabin appeared just as Grace was beginning to wonder if she could stay in the saddle much longer. It was a simple one-room structure nestled against a stand of pines, nearly invisible until they were almost upon it. "It's not much," Jack said as he helped her dismount, careful not to touch her bruised sides, "but it's solid and dry." Inside, the cabin was spare but clean. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furniture, a table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed, and a small cupboard filled the rest of the space. Jack busied himself with starting a fire while Grace sank gratefully onto one of the wooden chairs, her legs trembling with fatigue and lingering fear. "There should be some dried meat and beans in that cupboard," Jack said, nodding toward the small storage area. "And I'll fetch water from the stream out back." When he stepped outside to tend to the horses and get water, Grace allowed herself a moment of complete vulnerability. Tears she'd held back for hours spilled down her cheeks, stinging the cut on her lip. She had escaped, but to what? A life of running and looking over her shoulder. Harold wasn't a man who would simply let her go. By the time Jack returned, Grace had composed herself and found the promised provisions. She was setting out the simple meal on the table when he entered with a bucket of fresh water. "I've got something that might help with those bruises," he said, reaching into his saddlebag and producing a small tin. "Arnica salve. My mother swore by it." He set it on the table in front of her without ceremony, then turned to hang his coat by the door, giving her privacy. Grace opened the tin and carefully applied the salve to her face, wincing at the tenderness but grateful for the coolness against her heated skin. "Your mother was wise," she said after a moment. "It does help." Jack nodded, taking a seat at the table and accepting the plate of beans and jerky she offered. "She was. Raised 4 boys and ran our family ranch after my father died. Taught us a man's strength is in how he treats those who are vulnerable, not in how hard he can hit." The statement, delivered without any particular emphasis, struck Grace deeply. How different her life might have been if Harold had been raised with such values. "I must look a sight," she said, self-conscious under his occasional glances. "You look like someone who's survived," Jack replied simply. "That's nothing to be ashamed of." They ate in companionable silence, the fire crackling in the hearth casting warm light throughout the cabin. Grace found herself relaxing incrementally, the immediate terror of discovery receding with each passing minute. "You should take the bed," Jack said when they had finished eating. "I'll be fine by the fire." "I can't put you out of a bed," Grace protested. "You've already done so much." Jack's smile was brief but genuine. "Madam, I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. A wooden floor with a roof overhead is luxury enough." Too exhausted to argue further, Grace accepted his offer with quiet thanks. As she settled onto the narrow bed, pulling the rough woolen blanket around her shoulders, she watched Jack spread his bedroll near the hearth. "Mr. Quinn," she said softly. He looked up, waiting. "Why did you really help me? The truth, please." Jack was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "3 years ago, my sister was married to a man who treated her the way your husband treats you. By the time we realized what was happening, it was too late." He looked up, meeting her gaze directly. "No one helped her when she needed it most. I won't make that mistake again." The simple, heartbreaking explanation hung in the air between them. Grace nodded, unable to find words adequate to respond. "Get some rest, Mrs. Seymour," Jack said, his voice gentling. "Tomorrow's another day and you'll need your strength." Grace closed her eyes, surprised to find that, despite everything, she felt safe for the first time in years. As she drifted towards sleep, she heard Jack add quietly, "And out here, you can be whoever you want to be. Harold Seymour doesn't own these mountains or the sky above them." The promise in those words followed Grace into her dreams, which for once were not filled with fear. Morning arrived with gentle persistence, sunlight filtering through the cabin's single window and birdsong replacing the night's silence. Grace woke slowly, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. The events of the previous day rushed back, bringing with them a complex mixture of fear and relief. Jack was already up, his bedroll neatly stowed. Through the open door, Grace could see him tending to the horses, his movements efficient and practiced. She sat up carefully, taking stock of her injuries in the clear light of day. Her ribs ached dully, and her face felt tight with bruising, but she had endured worse. By the time Jack returned to the cabin, Grace had managed to wash her face with the remaining water and smooth her hair as best she could with her fingers. "Morning," he said, hanging his hat on a peg by the door. "How are you feeling?" "Better," Grace replied, and was surprised to find it wasn't entirely a lie. "Thank you for." She gestured vaguely, encompassing everything from the rescue to the cabin to the simple kindness of not staring at her injuries. Jack nodded, accepting her gratitude without fanfare. "I made coffee," he said, moving to the small pot balanced on a rock near the fire's embers. "It's strong, fair warning." The normalcy of the moment, sharing coffee in a sunlit cabin as if they were old friends rather than strangers thrown together by desperate circumstances, gave Grace a strange sense of peace. She wrapped her hands around the tin cup he offered, savoring the warmth and the rich aroma. "What happens now?" she asked after taking a cautious sip of the indeed very strong coffee. Jack leaned against the table, his own cup cradled in weathered hands. "That depends on you. Clearwater Ranch is still an option. Sarah Clearwater's a widow who runs the place with just her foreman and a couple of hands. She could use help with household matters, and she's not one to ask questions about a person's past. And if Harold comes looking—" "Sarah's not fond of men who raise their hands to women," Jack said, a hint of steel entering his voice. "Her place is about as safe as anywhere in the territory for you." Grace considered this, weighing her limited options. "And you, will you return to Opal eventually?" Jack confirmed. "I've got business to finish there, but not right away." The thought of Jack riding back into the town where Harold held sway sent a chill through Grace. "He'll know you helped me. It won't be safe for you either." Jack's smile was brief but genuine. "Mrs. Seymour, Grace," she interrupted. "Please just call me Grace." Something softened in his expression. "Grace, then. I've been riding these ranges since I was old enough to sit a horse. I know every trail, creek, and canyon for 100 miles, and I've dealt with men like your husband before. Don't worry about me." His quiet confidence was reassuring, but Grace couldn't entirely dismiss her concerns. Harold's rage had always been most dangerous when his pride was wounded, and a wife running away with another man's help would be an unforgivable insult. They finished their coffee and prepared to leave, Grace helping to clean the small cabin while Jack readied the horses. The domestic simplicity of the tasks was soothing, a reminder of life before Harold, when ordinary days hadn't been filled with walking on eggshells and anticipating violence. As they rode away from the cabin, the morning sun warm on their backs, Grace felt an unexpected lightness. The fear was still there, lurking beneath the surface, but for the first time in years, possibility stretched before her like the open Wyoming landscape. Jack led them on a circuitous route, avoiding main trails and keeping to higher ground where they could see anyone approaching from a distance. He didn't speak much as they rode, but his presence was reassuring, solid and dependable as the mountains themselves. Around midday, they stopped in a sheltered valley to rest the horses and eat a simple meal of jerky and the last of the bread Jack had packed. Grace sat on a sun-warmed rock, watching as Jack checked Willow's hooves with gentle efficiency. "You're good with horses," she observed. Jack glanced up, a faint smile touching his lips. "They're honest creatures, no pretense about them. They tell you exactly what they're thinking." "Unlike people," Grace said softly. "Some people," Jack corrected, straightening up. "Others are as straight-talking as any horse. You just need to find the right ones." Grace looked away, her gaze traveling across the valley to the distant mountains. "I thought Harold was the right one once. I was so certain." Jack was quiet for a moment, giving her words the respect of consideration. "Some men are good at hiding what they are," he finally said. "They show you what you want to see until they have you where they want you." The simple truth of this statement brought a lump to Grace's throat. How easily Harold had charmed her with his sophisticated manners and ambitious plans, making her feel special and cherished until the wedding ring was firmly on her finger. The change hadn't been immediate but gradual, criticism becoming control, control becoming threats, threats becoming violence. "I should have seen it sooner," she whispered, more to herself than to Jack. "No." Jack's voice was firm enough that Grace looked up in surprise. He was watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Don't take that burden on yourself. Men like Harold count on women blaming themselves. It's how they keep control." Before Grace could respond, Jack's attention suddenly shifted. His body tensed as he scanned the ridge above them. "We need to move," he said, his voice dropping to a murmur. "Now." Grace followed his gaze but saw nothing. "What is it?" "Dust trail about 2 miles back," Jack said, already moving to gather their things. "Could be nothing, could be trouble. Either way, we're not waiting to find out." They mounted quickly, Jack leading them into a narrow canyon that Grace wouldn't have noticed if he hadn't pointed it out. The walls rose steeply on either side, providing cover as they made their way through the twisting passage. "Clearwater Ranch is just beyond these foothills," Jack explained as they emerged on the other side. "But we'll circle wide, make sure we're not leading anyone straight to Sarah's door." Grace's heart pounded with renewed fear, but she forced herself to remain calm. Panicking wouldn't help either of them now. They rode hard for the next hour, Jack frequently checking behind them and occasionally altering their course. By the time the ranch buildings came into view in the distance, Grace was certain they had lost any potential pursuers. Clearwater Ranch was larger than Grace had expected, a sprawling main house surrounded by several outbuildings, corrals, and a large barn. The property was nestled against the foothills with a clear stream running alongside it, cottonwoods providing welcome shade around the house itself. As they approached, a woman emerged onto the porch, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. She was tall and straight-backed, with silver streaking her dark hair, which was pulled into a practical knot at the nape of her neck. "Jack Quinn," she called as they drew closer. "Didn't expect to see you this side of the territory for another month at least." Jack touched his hat brim in greeting. "Circumstances changed, Sarah. Hope we're not imposing." Sarah Clearwater's sharp gaze shifted to Grace, taking in the visible bruises without comment. "Never known you to impose in all the years I've known you," she said simply. "Come on in. You both look like you could use a proper meal." The inside of the Clearwater house was comfortably furnished, with colorful quilts draped over solid furniture and bookshelves lining one wall. It spoke of a life well lived and a woman of practical tastes, but not without appreciation for beauty. Sarah showed Grace to a small bedroom off the main hallway. "You can wash up in here," she said, indicating a pitcher and basin on the dresser. "I'll find you some clean clothes. Dinner's in an hour." When Sarah left, closing the door behind her, Grace sank onto the edge of the bed in exhaustion and relief. The room was simple but clean, with a window overlooking a small garden. It felt like sanctuary. She washed away the dust of travel, wincing as the cloth passed over her bruises but grateful for the chance to feel clean again. The clothes Sarah provided, a sturdy blue skirt and white blouse, were slightly large but wonderfully fresh. When Grace emerged, she found Jack and Sarah in the kitchen, their conversation stopping as she entered. Jack stood, a gesture of respect that brought unexpected warmth to Grace's cheeks. "Better?" Sarah asked, her direct gaze assessing but not unkind. Grace nodded. "Much. Thank you for your hospitality, Mrs. Clearwater." "Sarah," the older woman corrected, "and it's no trouble. Any friend of Jack's is welcome here." She turned back to the stove where something delicious was simmering. "Besides, I could use another pair of hands around the place. If you're interested in staying a while, that is." The offer, made casually but with clear intent, brought tears to Grace's eyes that she quickly blinked away. "I would be very grateful for the opportunity." Sarah nodded once, accepting the matter as settled. "Good. Now sit and eat. Both of you look half-starved." The meal, venison stew with fresh bread, was the best Grace had eaten in months. Harold had never approved of hearty food, insisting on elaborate but often unsatisfying meals that showcased their status rather than providing real nourishment. As they ate, Sarah and Jack spoke of ranch business and local matters, including Grace in the conversation without forcing her to contribute. It was a simple kindness that Grace appreciated deeply. "Jack tells me you're from back east originally," Sarah said as she poured coffee after the meal. Grace nodded. "Chicago. I came west with my husband 3 years ago when he saw opportunity in the oil fields around Opal." "And now you're looking for a fresh start," Sarah stated rather than asked. "Yes," Grace confirmed, her hands tightening around her coffee cup. "If that's possible." Sarah's weathered face softened slightly. "It's always possible, girl. I came out here 30 years ago with nothing but the clothes on my back and a stubborn refusal to accept the life that had been laid out for me. Never regretted it a day." Jack cleared his throat. "Sarah's being modest. She and her husband built this ranch from nothing. When he died 10 years back, everyone expected her to sell up and move to town. Instead, she expanded." Pride flashed in Sarah's eyes. "Men around here couldn't believe a woman could run a successful cattle operation. I took particular pleasure in proving them wrong." The story gave Grace hope. If Sarah Clearwater could forge her own path in this wild country, perhaps Grace could find her way too. Later, as the evening settled around the ranch, Grace found herself on the porch with Jack. Sarah had retired early, leaving them with a lamp and the peaceful sounds of a Wyoming night. "Will you leave tomorrow?" Grace asked, watching Jack's profile in the soft lamplight. He nodded slowly. "Need to get back, make sure no one connects me to your disappearance. The longer I'm gone, the more suspicious it looks." Fear clutched at Grace's heart. "Be careful. Harold isn't a forgiving man." Jack turned to look at her, his expression serious. "Neither am I when it comes to certain things." He hesitated, then added, "I'll be back in 2 weeks if you're still here, to check on you." The promise hung in the air between them, weighted with something Grace wasn't ready to examine too closely. "I'll be here," she said simply. They sat in companionable silence until the lamp began to sputter. Only then did they say good night, Jack heading to the bunkhouse while Grace returned to her new room. As she lay in the unfamiliar bed, Grace realized that for the first time in years, she was looking forward to tomorrow rather than dreading it. The next morning, Jack departed at dawn. Grace watched from her window as he rode away, his straight-backed figure gradually diminishing against the vast landscape. Only when he had disappeared entirely did she turn away to begin her new life at Clearwater Ranch. Sarah was as fair an employer as Jack had promised. She showed Grace the household duties she expected: cooking, cleaning, mending, but also made it clear that all who lived on Clearwater land contributed according to their abilities. "Can you ride?" Sarah asked on Grace's third day. "Not well," Grace admitted. "My husband didn't approve of women on horseback." Sarah's expression suggested exactly what she thought of that opinion, but all she said was, "Well, you'll learn. Can't get anywhere in this country without a good seat." The lessons began that afternoon, with Sarah herself teaching Grace how to properly saddle a horse and mount without fear. Willow, the mare Jack had chosen for her escape, remained her mount, and Grace found an unexpected joy in the growing partnership between woman and horse. Days passed, then weeks. Grace's bruises faded, and with them, some of the haunted look in her eyes. The physical labor of ranch life strengthened her body, while Sarah's matter-of-fact acceptance helped heal her spirit. She learned to cook on a wood stove, to mend fences, to identify the subtle signs of changing weather, and to move through the world without constantly looking over her shoulder. 2 weeks after Jack's departure, Grace found herself watching the horizon more often than usual. When he finally appeared, riding easily across the open range toward the ranch house, she couldn't suppress her smile. "Told you he'd be back," Sarah commented as she passed behind Grace on the porch. "Jack Quinn keeps his word." Jack's visit was brief but significant. He brought news from Opal. Harold was still searching for Grace, offering rewards for information, but no one had connected her disappearance to Jack. The town marshal, never Harold's biggest supporter, had shown little enthusiasm for pursuing a wife who'd chosen to leave. "He'll keep looking," Jack warned as he prepared to leave again the following morning. "Men like that can't stand to lose what they consider their property." Grace nodded, the familiar fear stirring but no longer overwhelming. "I know, but I'm not hiding anymore. I'm building something here." Jack's approving smile warmed her more than the spring sunshine. "I can see that. It suits you." Over the following months, Jack's visits became a regular occurrence. Each time he stayed a little longer, helping with ranch work and bringing supplies from town that Sarah couldn't easily obtain. Grace found herself counting the days between his appearances, her heart lightening whenever his familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Summer faded into autumn, and the work on the ranch intensified as they prepared for winter. Grace, now comfortable on horseback, helped with the cattle drives to lower pastures, and learned to read the land as Sarah did, with respect and attention to its subtle changes. It was during the harvest festival in the nearby town of Rivercross that something shifted between Grace and Jack. Sarah had insisted they all attend, declaring that all work and no celebration makes for dull people and duller conversation. The small town was alive with music, food, and the warm camaraderie of people who understood the value of community in a harsh land. Lanterns hung from trees in the town square, casting golden light over tables laden with the bounty of local farms and ranches. Grace, wearing a dress Sarah had helped her make from fabric purchased on Jack's last supply run, felt something close to happiness as she watched children running between the tables and couples dancing to the lively fiddle music. "Might I have this dance?" Jack asked, appearing at her side with 2 cups of cider. He was dressed in his best clothes, still the attire of a working cowboy, but clean and well-mended. His hair, usually hidden beneath his hat, curled slightly at the nape of his neck. Grace hesitated only briefly before accepting. "I should warn you, I'm not very practiced." Jack's smile reached his eyes, crinkling the corners. "Neither am I. We can be unpracticed together." They joined the other dancers as the music shifted to a slower waltz. Jack's hand was warm and steady at her waist, his movements more graceful than he'd claimed. As they turned around the makeshift dance floor, Grace realized she felt truly safe in a man's arms for the first time in years. "You're doing just fine," Jack murmured when she stumbled slightly. Grace looked up, finding his blue eyes watching her with a warmth that made her breath catch. "I had a good teacher," she replied softly. The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Sarah appeared, claiming Jack for the next dance with a knowing smile toward Grace, and the spell was momentarily broken. But something had changed. On the ride back to Clearwater that night, Grace was acutely aware of Jack riding beside her, his profile strong in the moonlight. The comfortable friendship that had grown between them over the months now seemed to hold the promise of something more. Winter arrived with its characteristic Wyoming ferocity, bitter cold and snow that transformed the landscape into a vast white wilderness. The ranch settled into the slower rhythms of the season, with days focused on keeping livestock fed and buildings maintained against the elements. Jack, who had taken to spending most of his time at Clearwater, proved invaluable during a particularly vicious blizzard that struck just after Christmas. While Sarah directed operations from the main house, Jack and the ranch hands fought their way through blinding snow to rescue cattle that had become trapped in a ravine. Grace waited anxiously, keeping the fire blazing and soup simmering for their return. When Jack finally stamped into the kitchen, snow crusting his hat and coat, his face raw from the wind, Grace couldn't stop herself from rushing to him. "You're half frozen," she scolded, helping him remove his ice-stiffened coat. Jack's laugh was tired but genuine. "Only half. Feels like all of me froze solid out there." Grace pressed a cup of hot coffee into his hands, their fingers brushing in a way that sent warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire. "You saved those cattle." "We did," Jack corrected, sinking gratefully into a chair by the stove. "It's what neighbors do out here. No one survives a Wyoming winter alone." As the blizzard raged outside, Grace and Jack sat in the kitchen's warmth, talking quietly about everything and nothing. Sarah, observing them from the doorway, smiled to herself before discreetly withdrawing. Later that night, as Grace prepared for bed, a soft knock sounded at her door. She opened it to find Jack standing in the hallway, his expression unusually serious. "I need to tell you something," he said without preamble. Grace's heart stuttered with sudden fear. "What is it? Is it Harold?" Jack shook his head quickly. No, nothing like that. He hesitated, then squared his shoulders. I'm buying the Carter place, the small spread that borders Clearwater to the east. Sarah's been helping me negotiate the deal. That's wonderful, Grace said, genuinely pleased for him but confused by his solemnity. You'll be a good rancher. The thing is, Jack continued, his gaze steady on hers, I didn't plan to settle down when I came to these parts, was just passing through, taking work where I could find it. But then things changed. What things? Grace asked softly, though something in her already knew the answer. I met you, Jack said simply. And for the first time I started thinking about a future in one place. A home. The word home resonated deeply with Grace, who had not truly had one since leaving her parents' house to marry Harold. The idea that she might have inspired such thoughts in Jack filled her with a complex mix of joy and fear. Jack, I'm still married, she reminded him, the painful reality intruding on the moment. I know, he acknowledged. And I respect that. I'm not asking for anything you can't give, Grace. I just wanted you to know why I'm staying. The honesty of his declaration moved her deeply. Thank you for telling me, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack nodded once, his eyes conveying what words could not, then bid her good night and returned to the bunkhouse. Spring arrived late but vigorously, the melting snow swelling streams and bringing new green life to the range eland. With it came news from Opal that changed everything. Jack returned from a supply run to Rivercross with a weeks-old newspaper and an expression that combined concern and cautious hope. You need to see this, he said, handing Grace the paper. The headline leapt from the page. Opal businessman Harold Seymour arrested for fraud and embezzlement. The article detailed how Harold had been systematically stealing from his business partners and manipulating oil lease agreements. His empire was crumbling, and he faced significant prison time. He won't be looking for you anymore, Jack said quietly. He's got bigger troubles now. Grace sat down heavily, the newspaper trembling in her hands. The man who had terrorized her thoughts for nearly a year was now himself confined, his power stripped away. The relief was overwhelming, bringing unexpected tears. I'm free, she whispered, the realization washing over her like a cleansing rain. Sarah, who had been listening from the doorway, stepped forward. You've been free since the day you decided to leave him, girl. This just makes it official. That night, Grace walked alone to the small rise behind the main house, a place where she often went to think. The stars spread across the Wyoming sky like diamonds scattered on velvet, and the spring air carried the scent of new growth and possibility. She heard Jack's approach before she saw him, his footsteps familiar and welcome. He stopped beside her, saying nothing, simply offering his presence as they gazed at the night sky together. I want to file for divorce, Grace said after a long moment. It's possible now with Harold imprisoned. I can claim abandonment or cruelty. Jack nodded, his profile strong against the starlit horizon. It's your right. And after, Grace continued, gathering her courage, after that, I was wondering if you might want company at that ranch you're building. Jack turned to her then, his expression a mixture of hope and caution. Are you sure? There's no rush, Grace. You've only just gotten your freedom. Grace smiled, reaching out to take his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady. I've had months to think about what I want. Freedom isn't just about escaping something bad, Jack. It's about choosing something good. Jack's answering smile was slow and genuine, reaching all the way to his eyes. In that case, I'd be honored to have your company for as long as you choose to give it. They stood together under the vast Wyoming sky, hands clasped, the promise of tomorrow stretching before them like the endless prairie. The divorce proceedings were straightforward but not quick. Wyoming Territory had progressive laws regarding women's rights, but the legal system still moved at its own deliberate pace. Grace traveled to Cheyenne twice, accompanied by Jack, to file papers and speak with a sympathetic judge who had seen too many cases of domestic abuse to doubt her testimony. Harold, desperate to salvage any dignity from his downfall, did not contest the divorce. By autumn, Grace was legally free, her former name Grace Sullivan restored to her by court order. The day the final papers arrived at Clearwater Ranch was cause for celebration. Sarah insisted on opening a bottle of fine whiskey she'd been saving for a special occasion, and the entire ranch gathered for an impromptu feast. "To new beginnings," Sarah toasted, raising her glass to Grace, "and to the courage it takes to claim them." Later that evening, Jack found Grace on the porch, wrapped in a shawl against the crisp autumn air. Without a word, he sat beside her on the wooden swing, his solid presence a comfort she had come to rely on. "So," he said after a comfortable silence, "Miss Sullivan, now that you're officially your own woman again, what are your plans?" Grace turned to look at him, taking in the face that had become so dear to her, the clear blue eyes, the laugh lines that spoke of joy found despite hardship, the quiet strength that never demanded but always supported. "My plans," she said slowly, "include accepting a certain proposal if it's still being offered." Jack's smile began in his eyes and spread to his lips. "It is," he confirmed, "though I should probably make it official." He shifted to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "Grace Sullivan, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because you need my protection or my name, but because I love you and hope you might love me too." The simple, heartfelt words brought tears to Grace's eyes. "I do love you, Jack Quinn, and yes, I'll marry you." Their wedding took place on a clear November day, with the distant mountains wearing their first crown of snow and the ranch lands spread around them in autumn gold. Sarah hosted the ceremony at Clearwater, insisting it was only right since this is where you two found each other. The celebration was small but joyful ranch hands, and neighbors gathering to witness the union of two people whose journey to each other had been neither straight nor easy, but all the more precious for its challenges. Grace wore a dress of deep blue, the color of the Wyoming sky that had become her true home. Jack, standing tall and proud in a new suit, watched her approach with an expression of wonder that made her heart soar. The minister, a traveling preacher who served the scattered ranches and homesteads of the region, spoke of commitment and partnership, of love that chooses and endures. When Jack and Grace exchanged their vows, the words were simple but profound, promises made with full knowledge of both life's hardships and its joys. "I take you as you are," Jack said, his voice steady as he placed the ring on Grace's finger. "All that you've been, all that you are now, and all that you will become." Grace, looking up into the face of the man who had first spoken softly to her on her worst day, replied with equal certainty. "And I take you, Jackson Quinn, promising to walk beside you through whatever life brings as your equal and your love." When they kissed to seal their vows, the cheers from their friends seemed to echo across the open range, a joyful sound in a land that had seen its share of hardship. The Quinn Ranch, which Jack had been steadily building throughout the summer and fall, became their home the day after the wedding. It was modest compared to Clearwater, a sturdy cabin with 2 rooms, a barn and corrals for the small herd Jack had begun to assemble, but to Grace, it was a palace. Every board had been placed with care, every decision made with their future in mind. "It's not much yet," Jack said as he carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner, "but we'll build it together." "It's perfect," Grace assured him, her arms around his neck. "It's ours." Their first year of marriage brought challenges and triumphs in equal measure. The winter was harsh, testing their preparedness and resilience. Spring floods washed out part of their eastern pasture. A mountain lion took 3 calves before Jack and the neighboring ranchers could track and dispatch it. But there were joys, too, the satisfaction of watching their herd grow, the pleasure of making their cabin into a home, the simple happiness of falling asleep and waking beside each other. Grace planted a garden that flourished under her care, and Jack expanded the cabin, adding a proper kitchen that became the heart of their home. Sarah was a frequent visitor, offering advice and assistance without interfering. "You two are doing just fine," she observed after their first cattle drive. "Better than fine. You're thriving." As their second Christmas as husband and wife approached, Grace confirmed what she had suspected for several weeks: she was expecting their first child. She told Jack on a snowy evening as they sat before the fire, his head in her lap as she read aloud from one of the books they'd ordered from back east. "Jack," she said, setting the book aside, "I have news." He looked up at her, his expression curious. "Good news or worrying news?" "The best news," Grace said, taking his hand and placing it over her still flat stomach. "We're going to have a baby." Jack's face transformed with wonder and joy. He sat up, gathering her gently into his arms. "A baby," he repeated, his voice thick with emotion. "Our baby." "Due in early summer, I think," Grace said, leaning into his embrace. "Are you happy?" Jack's laugh was answer enough, but he added words to reassure her. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it, Grace. There aren't words big enough." Their son, William James Quinn, was born on a perfect June morning in 1881, with Sarah Clearwater serving as midwife. He had his father's blue eyes and his mother's determined spirit, announcing his arrival with lusty cries that made both parents laugh through happy tears. "He's perfect," Jack whispered, cradling his son with careful hands that had built fences and broken horses, but now trembled with the precious weight of new life. Grace, exhausted but radiant, watched her husband and son with a heart so full it seemed impossible it could contain so much love. "He is," she agreed, "and he's safe. He'll always be safe with us." The promise was one they both understood deeply, a vow that the cycle of violence Grace had escaped would never touch their child. William would grow up knowing only the strength that protects, never the kind that harms. As the years passed, the Quinn ranch prospered. Jack's skill with horses and Grace's sharp mind for business proved a powerful combination. They added to their land holdings, built a larger house as their family grew, and became respected members of the community that had welcomed Grace when she had nothing but hope and determination. William was joined by a sister, Sarah Elizabeth, named for the woman who had given Grace shelter when she needed it most. 2 years later, Thomas Henry completed their family, a laughing boy with his mother's gentle heart and his father's steady hands. Through it all, Jack and Grace remained partners in the truest sense, sharing work and dreams, supporting each other through difficulties, and celebrating each success together. The bruises of Grace's past faded completely, replaced by the marks of a life well lived. Laugh lines around her eyes, calluses on her capable hands, and the invisible but indelible imprint of happiness on her spirit. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Jack surprised Grace with a special gift, a small silver locket containing miniature portraits of their children. "To remind you of what we've built together," he said, as he fastened it around her neck. "From that night, you hid behind a water trough to this moment right here." Grace touched the locket, then reached up to trace the lines of her husband's face, still handsome to her despite the gray now threading his hair and the weathering of years spent working under the Wyoming sun. "I never imagined this life was possible," she admitted. That night, all I hoped for was escape. I never dreamed I'd find a home, a family, a love like this. Jack caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. You did more than find it, Grace. You helped create it, every day with every choice. As the setting sun painted the ranch in gold and long shadows, Grace and Jack stood together on the porch of the home they had built, watching their children chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. The distant mountains stood sentinel as they always had, witnesses to the journey of a woman who had fled violence and found healing, and a man who had spoken softly and loved completely. "No regrets?" Jack asked, his arm around her waist. Grace leaned into his embrace, the familiar warmth of him as essential to her now as air. "Not one," she assured him. "Every step, even the painful ones, led me here. To you, to our children, to this life." As darkness settled over the Wyoming range, stars appearing one by one in the vast sky, Grace Quinn knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety but joy, not just escape but purpose. The girl who had once borne bruises in silent shame now stood tall as a woman who had claimed her right to happiness and built a legacy of love that would endure long after the last traces of violence had been forgotten. In the gentle night, surrounded by all she had created from the ashes of her former life, Grace whispered a silent thank you to the young woman who had once found the courage to climb down a trellis and run into an uncertain future. That single act of bravery had opened the door to everything that mattered, a life where soft words healed, where strength protected rather than harmed, and where love, freely given and joyfully received, had the final word.